How did you realize your child's teacher was deliberately traumatizing them? I found the drawings hidden under my daughter's bed while looking for her missing library book. 6 pieces of paper covered in black crayon so thick the wax had built up in layers. Each drawing showed the same thing. A small figure with yellow hair cowering in a corner, while a tall figure with dark hair loomed over it holding what looked like scissors. The tall figure had a red slash for a mouth and empty circles for eyes. At the bottom of each page, my 7-year-old daughter Iris had written the same words over and over. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. My hands started shaking as I flipped through the drawings. Iris had always loved art, and her pictures were usually full of rainbows and flowers and our dog Max. These drawings were different, dark and repetitive and terrifying. I called for Iris and she appeared in the doorway of her room. Her face went white when she saw what I was holding. She said, "Please don't show Ms. Novak," in a voice so small I barely heard it. I asked who Ms. Novak was, and Iris said my teacher. I knelt down and asked why she didn't want me to show her teacher. Iris started crying and said, "Because then she'll know I told and she'll be more mad." I pulled Iris into my arms and felt her whole body shaking. I asked what Ms. Novak would be mad about, and Iris whispered that she'd been bad at school. I said everyone makes mistakes and teachers don't get mad about that. Iris pulled back and looked at me with tears running down her face. She said, "You don't understand. Ms. Novak says I'm the worst student she's ever had." I felt ice run through my veins. I asked Iris what exactly Ms. Novak had said to her. Iris wouldn't look at me. She stared at the floor and said Ms. Novak tells her every day that she's stupid and slow and will never learn anything. That she wastes everyone's time by being in the class. That the other kids would learn better if Iris wasn't there taking up space. I asked how long this had been going on, and Iris said since the first week of school. It was now October. My daughter had been enduring this for 2 months. I asked why she hadn't told me sooner, and Iris said Ms. Novak told her that if she tattled to her parents, she would make things worse. That she would call me in for a meeting and tell me how bad Iris was, and then I'd be disappointed in her too. I held Iris and told her she was brilliant and kind and perfect, and that I was calling the school immediately. Iris grabbed my arm and begged me not to. She said Ms. Novak would know she told. I promised I wouldn't mention the drawings or anything Iris said. I would just ask for a meeting to discuss her progress. Iris looked unconvinced but nodded. I called the school office and asked to schedule a meeting with Ms. Novak and the principal. The secretary said she'd check their calendars and call me back. That evening, I showed my husband Trevor the drawings. He stared at them for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "This is abuse." I said, "I know." Trevor asked if I thought there was any chance Iris was exaggerating or misunderstanding. I said, "You saw her face when I found these. She's terrified." Trevor agreed we needed to handle this carefully. We couldn't just accuse a teacher without evidence beyond Iris's account. I said that's why I asked for a meeting. We'd assess Ms. Novak's demeanor and see if she revealed anything. Trevor said he wanted to come to the meeting too. The school called back the next morning and scheduled us for Friday afternoon, 3 days away. I asked if anything sooner was available, and the secretary said no. Both Ms. Novak and Principal Hayes had packed schedules. I said fine and hung up. Those 3 days felt like an eternity. I watched Iris carefully each morning before school. She moved slowly, getting ready, and barely touched her breakfast. Each day when I dropped her off at the classroom door, she hesitated before going in. I noticed Ms. Novak standing at the front of the room watching. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp features and gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She never smiled. On Thursday, I decided to observe pickup more carefully. I arrived 15 minutes early and positioned myself where I could see into the classroom window. Ms. Novak was at the front teaching something on the board. Most kids were watching, but a few were distracted. I saw Iris sitting in the back row staring at her desk. Ms. Novak suddenly stopped teaching and walked directly to Iris. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Ms. Novak lean down and speak directly into Iris's face. Iris shrank back in her chair. Ms. Novak grabbed Iris's paper off the desk and held it up to the class. I saw other kids laughing. Iris's face was bright red. Ms. Novak crumpled the paper and dropped it on Iris's desk. Then she returned to the front and continued teaching. My hands clenched into fists. I'd just witnessed public humiliation. When the bell rang, I went to the classroom door with the other parents. Iris came out with her head down. In the car, I asked what had happened with her paper. Iris said she'd drawn on her math worksheet because she didn't understand the problems. Ms. Novak had shown everyone and said this is what happens when you don't pay attention. Iris said all the kids laughed at her. I told Iris that was wrong and we were going to fix this tomorrow at the meeting. Iris just stared out the window. Friday afternoon, Trevor and I sat in Principal Hayes' office waiting. He was a man in his 40s with glasses and a friendly smile that seemed genuine. Ms. Novak arrived exactly on time and sat across from us. She gave us a tight smile and said she was glad we'd requested this meeting. She'd been meaning to discuss Iris's performance with us. I said that's actually why we're here. We're concerned about Iris's progress this year. Ms. Novak nodded and pulled out a folder. She said Iris is significantly behind grade level in reading and math. She doesn't participate in class and seems distracted most of the time. She's not turning in homework, and when she does, the quality is poor. Principal Hayes asked if we'd noticed these issues at home. Trevor said Iris had always been a good student. Her kindergarten and first grade teachers gave glowing reports. Ms. Novak said, well, second grade is when we separate students who can handle the work from those who can't. Some children just aren't academically inclined. I felt anger rising but kept my voice calm. I said Iris is very bright. Something has changed this year and we want to understand what. Ms. Novak's expression shifted slightly. She said some students need more structure and discipline than others. Iris seems to require constant redirection, and that takes time away from students who are actually trying to learn. Trevor asked what kind of redirection she meant. Ms. Novak said reminders to pay attention and follow instructions and complete work properly. Standard classroom management. I asked if that included public humiliation. Ms. Novak's eyes narrowed. She said, I don't know what you mean. I described what I'd seen through the window yesterday. Ms. Novak said she'd held up an example of unacceptable work to demonstrate to the class what not to do. That's a normal teaching technique. Principal Hayes shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. He said maybe we should discuss strategies to help Iris improve rather than focus on specific incidents. I said no, I want to focus on specific incidents because I think there's a pattern of targeting my daughter. Ms. Novak stood up. She said, I've been teaching for 28 years and I don't appreciate accusations from parents who don't understand classroom dynamics. If Iris is struggling, it's because she lacks the skills and discipline needed for this grade level. Perhaps you should consider having her evaluated for special education. Principal Hayes tried to de-escalate, saying, let's all take a breath. Trevor said we're not interested in special education evaluation. We want to know why our daughter suddenly hates school and draws disturbing pictures about her teacher. Ms. Novak's face went red. She asked what pictures. I said that's not relevant right now. What's relevant is that Iris is showing signs of anxiety and trauma. Ms. Novak said if Iris is anxious, it's because she knows she's not meeting expectations. Students need to learn that actions have consequences. I asked what consequences a 7-year-old should face for not understanding math. Ms. Novak said natural consequences. Embarrassment motivates improvement. I stood up and said embarrassing a child in front of their peers is bullying, not teaching. Ms. Novak said you clearly don't understand education. Perhaps that's why your daughter is struggling. She obviously doesn't get support at home. Trevor stood too and said this meeting is over. We'll be filing a formal complaint. Principal Hayes said, wait, let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work this out. I said there's nothing to work out. I want my daughter moved to a different classroom immediately. Principal Hayes said classroom transfers are complicated. We need to evaluate whether it's truly necessary. Trevor said it's necessary. Our daughter is being emotionally abused. Ms. Novak laughed. She said emotional abuse. Because I hold students accountable. You're raising a generation of entitled children who can't handle criticism. Principal Hayes said, Ms. Novak, perhaps you should step out while I discuss options with the parents. Ms. Novak gathered her folder and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned and said, good luck finding a teacher who will coddle your daughter. She'll fail everywhere if she can't handle basic expectations. The door closed behind her. Principal Hayes rubbed his temples. He said, I apologize for Ms. Novak's tone. She's passionate about her work, but sometimes comes across as harsh. I said harsh is an understatement. She just demonstrated exactly the kind of behavior we're concerned about. Principal Hayes said he'd look into the situation but needed specific documentation. I said I have drawings my daughter made and I witnessed the incident with the crumpled paper. What more do you need? Principal Hayes said parent observations and child artwork aren't sufficient evidence for disciplinary action against a teacher. I'd need multiple documented complaints from multiple sources. Trevor asked how many other parents have complained about Ms. Novak. Principal Hayes said he couldn't discuss other parents, but he could say this was the first formal complaint he'd received about her this year. I said because she probably terrifies the kids into silence. Principal Hayes said he understood our concerns, but his hands were tied without more evidence. He suggested we give it a few more weeks while he monitored the situation. I said absolutely not. I'm not sending my daughter back into that classroom. Principal Hayes said if we refused to send Iris to school, we'd be violating truancy laws. He could arrange for Iris to spend time in the library during Ms. Novak's class while they worked on a transfer. That was the best he could offer right now. I wanted to scream, but I knew getting angry wouldn't help Iris. I said fine. Iris goes to the library starting Monday, and you have 1 week to arrange a permanent transfer. If it's not done by then, we're escalating to the district superintendent. Principal Hayes agreed and said he'd notify the librarian. Trevor and I left feeling frustrated and helpless. That weekend, Iris seemed lighter, knowing she wouldn't have to face Ms. Novak again. Monday morning, I walked her to the library instead of her classroom. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, was kind and set Iris up with books and activities. I felt marginally better leaving her there. At pickup, Iris seemed happier than she'd been in weeks. She showed me the book she'd read and said Mrs. Chen let her help organize the picture books. It was the most she'd talked about school in months. That evening, Principal Hayes called. He said he'd spoken with Ms. Novak about our concerns, and she denied any inappropriate behavior. He'd also checked with the other second-grade teachers about availability for a transfer. None had space in their classrooms currently. I asked when space might open up. Principal Hayes said he couldn't predict that. It could be weeks or months. I said that's unacceptable. Hayes said he was doing everything he could within district policy. I hung up furious. Trevor suggested we contact other parents in Ms. Novak's class to see if their kids were having similar experiences. I thought that was smart. I reached out to 3 mothers whose numbers I had from the class contact list. The first 2 said their children were doing fine and seemed happy. The third mother, Paula, hesitated when I asked. She said her son Kevin had mentioned Ms. Novak was mean, but she'd figured all kids thought teachers were mean sometimes. I asked if Kevin had said anything specific. Paula said he'd told her Ms. Novak yelled at kids who got answers wrong and made them stand in the corner during recess. I felt my stomach drop. I told Paula what had happened with Iris. Paula was quiet for a moment, then said she'd talk to Kevin and get back to me. She called 2 hours later. Her voice was shaking. She said she'd asked Kevin more questions and he'd started crying. He said Ms. Novak called him stupid and said he'd never amount to anything, that she'd made him sit under her desk as punishment for talking during class, that she'd taken away his lunch one day and made him watch everyone else eat. Paula was crying now. She said she couldn't believe she'd missed the signs. I said these teachers are good at hiding abuse and making kids too scared to tell. Paula asked what we should do. I said file a formal complaint with Principal Hayes immediately. The more parents who complain, the harder it is for them to ignore. Paula filed her complaint Monday morning. By Wednesday, 2 more parents had come forward with similar stories. Ms. Novak had apparently been targeting multiple students with various forms of psychological abuse. Principal Hayes called an emergency meeting with all 5 sets of parents. He sat behind his desk looking stressed. He said he'd conducted preliminary interviews with the students who'd been named in complaints. The stories were consistent enough that he was taking the matter seriously. He'd placed Ms. Novak on administrative leave pending a formal investigation. I asked what the investigation would entail. Hayes said the district would send an investigator to interview students, parents, and other staff members. The process typically took 2 to 3 weeks. I asked what happened to the students in Ms. Novak's class during the investigation. Hayes said he'd arranged for a substitute teacher and was working on permanent classroom reassignments for the children who'd filed complaints. I felt relief wash through me. Finally, someone was taking this seriously. Paula asked if Ms. Novak would be allowed back if the investigation didn't find sufficient evidence. Hayes said that would depend on the investigator's findings and the district's determination. He couldn't make promises but wanted us to know he was committed to student safety. The district investigator arrived the following week. Her name was Lydia Frost, and she was a former teacher who now handled misconduct cases. She interviewed Iris at our home with Trevor and me present. Lydia asked Iris to describe a normal day in Ms. Novak's class. Iris was hesitant at first, but Lydia had a gentle manner that put her at ease. Iris described how Ms. Novak would call on students, and if they got the answer wrong, she'd sigh loudly and say something about how disappointing they were. How she'd make kids who didn't finish their work fast enough sit at a separate table during lunch. How she'd compare students to each other, saying things about why can't you be smart and well-behaved as so-and-so. Iris said Ms. Novak had favorite students who could do no wrong, and other students like Iris who she seemed to hate. Lydia asked if Ms. Novak had ever touched her inappropriately. Iris said no, but she'd grabbed her arm hard once when pulling her out of line. Lydia took detailed notes. She asked if Iris had told any other adults at school what was happening. Iris said she'd tried to tell the lunch monitor once, but the woman had said Ms. Novak was just strict, and Iris needed to follow rules. Lydia thanked Iris for being brave and gave her a sticker. After Iris left the room, Lydia said the stories she was hearing from multiple students were remarkably consistent. That typically indicated truthful reporting rather than coached responses. I asked what would happen next. Lydia said she'd complete all interviews by the end of the week and submit her findings to the district superintendent. The superintendent would then decide on appropriate disciplinary action. I asked what options existed. Lydia said it ranged from mandatory training and monitoring to suspension or termination depending on the severity and evidence. I said this feels pretty severe. Lydia agreed but said the process required following proper steps. She'd be recommending serious consequences but couldn't guarantee what the district would decide. She asked if we'd be willing to testify at a hearing if Ms. Novak contested any disciplinary action. I said absolutely. Lydia gave us her card and said she'd be in touch with updates. 2 weeks later, Lydia called. She said she'd submitted her report to the superintendent and it had been forwarded to Ms. Novak and her union representative. The district was recommending termination based on multiple substantiated instances of emotional abuse and violation of professional conduct standards. Ms. Novak had filed a grievance through her union claiming the investigation was biased and the evidence insufficient. There would be a hearing in front of the school board in 3 weeks where both sides would present their cases. Lydia said she'd be testifying about her findings and asked again if we'd be willing to participate. I said yes without hesitation. The 3 weeks before the hearing were tense. Ms. Novak's lawyer tried to contact several of the complaining parents offering settlements if we'd drop our complaints. None of us agreed. Trevor and I spent hours preparing our statement. We gathered every drawing Iris had made, documented the timeline of behavioral changes, and wrote detailed accounts of what we'd witnessed and heard. Paula and the other parents did the same. The night before the hearing, Iris asked if she'd have to see Ms. Novak again. I said not if she didn't want to. Children weren't required to attend the hearing. Iris said she wanted to go. She wanted to tell the school board what Ms. Novak had done. I was surprised but proud. I asked if she was sure, and she nodded. She said other kids needed to know it was okay to tell the truth. Trevor and I looked at each other. Our 7-year-old was braver than most adults. We said we'd be right there with her the whole time. The hearing was held in the school district's administrative building in a large conference room. The school board sat at a long table at the front. Ms. Novak sat with her lawyer and union representative on one side. The complaining families sat on the other side with Lydia Frost. The superintendent opened the hearing by explaining the process. Each side would present evidence and testimony. The board would then deliberate and issue a decision. Ms. Novak's lawyer went first. He argued that Ms. Novak was a dedicated teacher with nearly 3 decades of experience and no prior disciplinary issues. He said the complaints were based on misunderstandings and children's misinterpretations of normal classroom management techniques. He presented statements from several parents whose children had no complaints about Ms. Novak. He argued that holding high standards shouldn't be conflated with abuse. The district's lawyer went next. She presented Lydia's investigation report, which detailed 12 separate instances of emotional abuse across 5 different students. She called Lydia to testify. Lydia walked through her methodology and findings. She explained how she'd interviewed 23 students from Ms. Novak's class. 15 had described experiences consistent with emotional abuse. 8 had no complaints. The consistency of the reports from the 15 students combined with the specific details they provided indicated a pattern of targeted harassment. Ms. Novak's lawyer cross-examined Lydia, asking if she had any video or audio evidence of the alleged abuse. Lydia said no, but that didn't negate the credibility of multiple consistent witness accounts. The lawyer argued that children were unreliable witnesses who could be coached or influenced by their parents' feelings about a strict teacher. The district's lawyer then called Paula to testify. Paula described what her son Kevin had told her about sitting under the desk and having his lunch taken away. She said Kevin had developed anxiety about school and was now seeing a therapist. Ms. Novak's lawyer asked if Paula had any proof these incidents occurred. Paula said her son's word and his psychological distress were proof enough. The lawyer said that wasn't evidence of misconduct, just evidence that a child was having difficulty adjusting to second-grade expectations. I was called next. I walked to the front and sat at the testimony table. The district's lawyer asked me to describe what had led to our complaint. I explained finding the drawings and Iris's subsequent confession about Ms. Novak's treatment. I described witnessing the paper crumpling incident and the changes in Iris's behavior. I said before this year Iris loved school, and now she has nightmares about her classroom. Ms. Novak's lawyer cross-examined me, asking if I'd ever observed Ms. Novak directly abuse my daughter. I said I'd seen her publicly humiliate Iris, and that Iris's testimony about verbal abuse was credible. The lawyer said parents often believe their children uncritically. Had I considered that Iris might be exaggerating or lying to avoid accountability for poor performance? I felt rage bubble up but kept my voice steady. I said Iris is 7 years old. She's not sophisticated enough to fabricate the level of detail she provided. The lawyer said children that age have active imaginations. Trevor testified next and corroborated everything I'd said. Then the district's lawyer asked if any of the students wanted to testify. I looked at Iris. She was sitting between Paula's son Kevin and another girl named Sophie, whose parents had also complained. The 3 of them stood up together. The board members looked surprised. The district's lawyer said these children have volunteered to share their experiences directly. Is the board willing to hear from them? The board chair said yes, but we'll keep it brief and make sure they're comfortable. Iris walked to the front with Kevin and Sophie. A board member brought them cups of water, and they sat in chairs that were too big for them. The district's lawyer knelt down to their level and asked Iris to start. Iris's voice was quiet but clear. She said Ms. Novak made her feel stupid every day, that she was scared to go to school because she never knew what would make Ms. Novak mad, that Ms. Novak told her she was wasting space and the other kids would be better off without her there, that she'd drawn the pictures because she couldn't sleep from thinking about Ms. Novak's face and voice. Kevin spoke next. He said Ms. Novak made him sit under her desk for 30 minutes because he'd whispered to his friend during a test, that she'd called him worthless and said his parents should be ashamed. Sophie said Ms. Novak had pulled her hair when she wasn't standing straight in line, that she'd made Sophie apologize to the class for being disruptive when Sophie had just asked to use the bathroom. The 3 children spoke for 15 minutes, describing incident after incident. The board members' faces grew more disturbed with each story. Ms. Novak sat stone-faced, staring straight ahead. When the children finished, the board chair thanked them for their courage. Ms. Novak's lawyer asked if he could question the children. The board chair said no. These are young children testifying about traumatic experiences. We've heard enough. The lawyer protested, but the chair shut him down. Ms. Novak's lawyer asked if Ms. Novak could make a statement. The chair allowed it. Ms. Novak stood and faced the board. She said she'd devoted her life to education, and these accusations were devastating. She maintained high standards because she wanted students to succeed. If some students and parents interpreted that as meanness, it was a misunderstanding of her methods. She'd never intended to harm anyone. She became emotional, saying her reputation was being destroyed by a few disgruntled families whose children needed more discipline than they received at home. The board chair asked if she denied the specific incidents described by the students. Ms. Novak hesitated. She said she didn't recall every interaction with every student, but she'd never deliberately traumatized anyone. Some of the described incidents might have happened, but not in the malicious way they were being portrayed. The board chair said, so you're not denying you made students sit under your desk or took away their lunch or publicly humiliated them. Ms. Novak said those were consequences for misbehavior taken out of context. The chair said there is no context in which those actions are appropriate for 7-year-old children. The board went into closed session to deliberate. We waited in the hallway for 2 hours. Iris fell asleep on Trevor's lap. Kevin and Sophie played a game on Paula's phone. Finally, the board called us back in. The chair read from a prepared statement. The board had reviewed all evidence and testimony. They found credible evidence of multiple violations of the district's professional conduct policy. Ms. Novak had engaged in a pattern of emotional abuse that created a hostile educational environment for multiple students. The board was voting to terminate Ms. Novak's employment effective immediately. Ms. Novak would not be eligible for rehire in any district capacity. The board also recommended the state education department review her teaching license. Ms. Novak stood up and started yelling that this was a travesty, and she was being railroaded by helicopter parents who couldn't handle their children being held accountable. Her lawyer tried to quiet her, but she kept going. She pointed at our group and said those kids are soft and weak and will never survive in the real world. Security escorted her from the room while she was still shouting. The board chair apologized for the outburst and said the decision was final. Outside the building, Paula hugged me and we both cried. The other parents gathered around, sharing relief and disbelief that it was really over. Iris woke up and asked what happened. I knelt down and told her Ms. Novak wouldn't be teaching anymore, that the school board believed her and Kevin and Sophie, that she was safe now. Iris wrapped her arms around my neck and held on tight. On the drive home, Trevor said he was proud of how Iris had testified. I agreed. I said I was also furious that it had taken so much to get someone to listen, that our daughter and others had suffered for months before adults finally intervened. Trevor said at least the system worked eventually. I said barely. We got lucky that other parents came forward, and that the investigator was thorough, and that the board actually cared. How many kids suffer in silence because their parents don't notice or the school protects bad teachers? Trevor didn't have an answer for that. Over the following weeks, Iris slowly returned to normal. She transferred to another teacher's class and thrived. Her new teacher, Ms. Palmer, was warm and encouraging. Iris started smiling again, and her artwork went back to bright colors. The nightmares stopped after about a month. Paula told me Kevin was doing better too. The district offered free counseling to all the affected students, and most families took advantage of it. Iris saw a child psychologist for 3 months who helped her process what had happened and rebuild her confidence. 6 months after the hearing, I ran into Principal Hayes at the grocery store. He approached me and said he wanted to apologize for not acting more quickly when we first raised concerns. He said he should have investigated immediately instead of requiring more evidence. I appreciated the apology, but said it didn't change the fact that kids suffered while he was checking boxes. Hayes said he'd implemented new protocols for handling abuse complaints so it wouldn't happen again. I said I hoped that was true. A year after Ms. Novak's termination, I got a letter from the state education department. Ms. Novak had contested the revocation of her teaching license. There would be a hearing, and they wanted to know if I'd testify again. I said yes. The hearing was similar to the school board proceeding. Ms. Novak's lawyer argued she'd been unfairly terminated and deserved another chance. The state investigator presented evidence from the district case plus new information. They'd discovered Ms. Novak had been moved between schools 3 times in the past decade due to parent complaints. Each time the district had quietly transferred her rather than address the underlying behavior. There was a documented pattern going back 15 years. The state board voted to permanently revoke her teaching license. Ms. Novak filed a lawsuit against the district claiming wrongful termination. It was dismissed within 6 months. Iris is 10 now and in 5th grade. She's confident and happy and excelling in school. She recently told me she wants to be a teacher when she grows up, because she wants to be the kind of teacher kids feel safe with. I told her she'd be amazing at that. Sometimes Iris still talks about 2nd grade and Ms. Novak. She processes it differently now that she's older. She understands Ms. Novak was an adult with problems who took them out on children. Iris says she's glad she spoke up because it helped other kids. I'm proud of her courage and heartbroken that she had to develop it at 7 years old. Paula and I stayed friends, and our kids have playdates regularly. Kevin is doing well too, though Paula says he's still more anxious than he was before. The other families moved on with their lives. Last month, I volunteered for the district's parent advisory committee focused on student safety. I wanted to help create better systems for identifying and stopping teacher abuse early. During our first meeting, a new parent asked what had prompted the committee's formation. I told her about Iris and Ms. Novak and how close we'd come to nothing being done. The parent's face went pale, and she said her daughter had just started having nightmares about her fourth-grade teacher. We scheduled a meeting for the next day. The work of protecting kids never stops because there's always another teacher who thinks cruelty is pedagogy. 3 years after Ms. Novak's termination, Iris came home from school and told me her friend Emma was having problems with her teacher. Emma had mentioned the teacher yelled at students and made them feel stupid. I asked Iris what she thought we should do, and she said we should talk to Emma's mom tonight. I called Emma's mother and shared our experience. She started investigating and discovered her daughter's teacher had a history similar to Ms. Novak. She filed a complaint, and the district acted quickly this time. The teacher was placed on leave within a week. I like to think the system learned something from what happened to Iris, that schools are quicker to believe children now and slower to protect bad teachers. But I know that's probably optimistic. Change happens slowly, and institutions resist accountability. The best I can do is stay vigilant and help other parents recognize warning signs. Teach Iris and other kids that speaking up about abuse isn't tattling. Build networks of parents who won't accept that psychological harm is just strict teaching. Ms. Novak tried to break my daughter, but instead she made her fierce. Iris knows now that adults don't always protect children. Sometimes children have to protect themselves and each other. That's a terrible lesson for a 7-year-old to learn, but she's using it to help others, and I suppose that's the best outcome we can hope for from trauma. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.